rights are fundamental human rights. However, in spite of enormous attempts made by the international women rights movement over many years, girls and women around the world are still married at very young age, trafficked into forced labor, have been refused their access to education and political participation. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are very excited and delighted to have very special guest from Australia, whose journey has been more around advancing women's human rights, including advocating enabling environment for women entrepreneurs. Meet Jane Sloane. We welcome you, Jane. And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you a little bit more about Jane. She is Senior Director of Women Empowerment and Gender Equality at the Asia Foundation. So thank you so much, Jane, for joining us. We are very glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Rajni. Very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Jane. So Jane, it would be great to start this conversation with little bit introduction of your entrepreneurial journey. How did you get into women empowerment, advocating their rights? What made you to get into this?
Well, I think that I've always been wired with a sense of social justice. So I think it's something that I've had from a very young age. And, you know, I think as I grew older, I was always asking questions about what about the women? What's happening to women? And that became even more so when I was working with World Vision, for instance, and asking about how are women contributing? How are we ensuring that we're paying attention to women's needs and women's voices? And then we actually created a Women of Vision program because it seemed like the best way to do so was to really recognize that we needed to get funds into the hands of women. And so really, as I started asking those questions, I went deeper into that work. I recognized that I needed to go and spend time in the Pacific, in Asia, listening to women and hearing what women were saying about their needs and their own power and their access to resources. And so that really is a very short answer to a very long journey. I would say, though, that the role of mentors has been really critical for me in my own life, in really encouraging me to ask those questions and to be able to seek out the kinds of opportunities that I've been very fortunate to access.
Right. Wonderful, wonderful. So, Jane, in your career, I guess spanning over 20 years? Yeah? Spanning over 20 years?
Absolutely. I'm in my mid-50s now.
So what issues did you see regarding advancing women's human rights, which you believe are still not well addressed or under addressed and need immediate attention?
Well, I think it's a very uneven picture when you think about the advances that have been made in relation to both women's empowerment and gender equality more broadly. It really depends on the country and the context. So we can't say universally that we've really achieved great steps in terms of women's political participation or economic empowerment, because it really does depend on the country. In some countries, there have been some advances in terms of women's economic empowerment, but very few women in parliament or very few women having a political voice. And so I think that the issues that we're focused on at the Asia Foundation that are still so important today include, to your earlier point, a focus on women's economic empowerment, which includes a focus on worker rights, on women's entrepreneurship, on women's climate resilience, particularly at this time of COVID-19, women's rights and security, so really working to end violence against women, to end trafficking and forced migration, and to advance the women, peace and security agenda. And women's political participation, which includes formal participation in parliaments and in office, as well as women's grassroots leadership, leading movements and networks for change. And so those areas are all really important. And I would say that issues such as gender-based violence is really a cross-cutting issue. Without addressing gender-based violence, which is very much the hidden pandemic at the moment as we go through COVID-19, we can't really help to advance women's economic empowerment or women's political voice. And so that is a crucial issue to be addressing at this time.
Right. So Jane, when we are discussing about, very subjective things which vary from geography to geography, culture to culture, country to country. And among them, one of the trickiest set of challenges, which I personally feel, is cultural belief system, which is very difficult to break.
Yeah,
So, as an organization, how do you deal with such challenges? Because you know that that is not something you can just erase. That is there for
yeah.
many years. That is written on their culture, on their hearts, on their minds. How do you deal with such challenges? Yes.
Absolutely. And, when you're talking about gender norms or harmful um, social practices, we're really talking about things that contribute to trafficking, that contribute to child marriage, that contribute to female genital mutilation, that contribute to a whole range of issues that deny girls and women their potential. The way that we address this at the Asia Foundation is recognising that influencing gender norms, influencing social norms can't happen in isolation. We have to be paying attention to addressing laws and policies, ensuring that girls and women know their rights and can advocate for their rights, that they can access information and services to be able to support their advocacy. And then we also need to be engaging allies, men and boys as allies as well, in terms of this social norm or gender norm change. It's the important thing that we say to donors is that this isn't quick work. It actually takes years quite often to ensure that we are able to realise those changes. And so it's very important to have the kinds of strategies that will really address the root causes rather than the symptoms. So, for instance, some of the strategies that we engage include in Bangladesh, we work with a network of imams in terms of their interpretation of the Quran, so that they're able to realise that the Quran doesn't in any way support violence against women, gender-based violence, so that they can then engage men in their communities and their constituencies to ensure that they're not violent towards their wives or to women in their lives, and that the imams themselves can be advocates for change and champions for change. And so we really need to identify where the locus of power is to be able to inform that change. That doesn't, of course, just reside with men. It also resides very much with women and girls in different contexts. And so supporting girls and women's networks and movements for change. Girls and young women have been incredible champions in advocating for the end of child marriage, for instance, and advocating to educators, to community leaders in terms of that change. So that's what I mean by really focusing on those 4 areas of change. We really need to be able to focus on all 4 of those arenas to be able to get the level of change that we need. And if women and girls don't know their rights, then they can't be advocating for those changes. If they can't access that information and services, it makes it very hard to influence and educate others. If we're not working with governments to be able to put in place enabling policies, for instance, to ban child marriage or to ensure that it's only girls over the age of 18, it makes it harder to then influence gender norms, social norms, and to get that behavioural and attitudinal change. So that's why working holistically is very important to be able to see that gender norm change.
Yes, true. And I think it is very, very gradual and slow process. Changing mindset, changing belief system. One need to be very, very patient with that. You cannot expect immediate results. It may take decades, or it may not even result may not even come after decades. It may take many generations. Yes.
That's true. Although I would say that sometimes there is a situation within a country that becomes a circuit breaker. And so I think if you think back to the horrific rape of and killing of the woman on the bus in India, that, it was actually women's movements that had worked for legal and policy change and had designed all of the legislation to address gender-based violence and to ensure greater protections were in place for women and girls. And, at that point, there was a lot of pressure on India by other governments and people internationally to be able to address that horrific situation. And so that was a tipping point in the country. And sometimes that can happen really effectively in terms of gender norms as well, to be able to see that level of change. And of course, we've seen that with the Me Too movement, we've seen that with Black Lives Matter, we've seen that in so many ways now. And so that does give us hope, I think. And you yourself have been really effective with social media and mobilizing people online. So we should also recognize the power that is inherent in people and communities. And social media, it's why we also need to advocate for a very strong civil society and to ensure the independence of media is retained.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And since COVID-19 is impacting every nook and corner of the world, how do you see it is impacting all those projects which were very, very critical, especially designed for women empowerment? How do you see the impact of it in Australia and other countries?
Well, you know, in our work in Asia and the Pacific, I mean, we're seeing the real gendered impacts of COVID-19. And so I think that what we're seeing is an acceleration and an amplification of the issues that have already been impacting women. And so with gender-based violence, anything from 100% to a 500% increase in gender-based violence as a result of COVID-19. We're seeing, you know, women's livelihoods being affected because of the increased care responsibilities, childcare, elder care, which compromises their ability to access paid either paid jobs or to sustain their own businesses at this time. We're also seeing women at the front line as health workers, as community workers. And so they're at the front line of getting the of COVID-19, as well as, of course, being in the best position to be able to advocate for the kinds of policies and legal support to address the impact of COVID-19. So we need to be investing more in supporting women to be able to shape those policies and laws that will be really important in the longer term. And then, of course, we're also seeing the convergence of COVID-19, the impact of climate change, the impact of conflict. So what is really concerning at this time is that resources that have been focused on women's maternal health, sexual and reproductive health and rights are being diverted to the COVID response. And so we're in danger of losing ground with some of those important advances. And of course, in danger of compromising women's health if they can't give birth safely, or if their pregnancy is being compromised by not being able to access the medications because of everything being diverted to a COVID response. And so we have to also recognise what's at stake if we're not sustaining women's movements and networks to be able to hold ground at a time when there is so much losing ground.
Right. True. And Jane, in the last, would you love to give any message to women viewers who are watching this?
Oh gosh, well, I think that the strength of women, the power of women is really what holds up the world. And so I think that having that strength, that creativity, that innovative spirit is just so important at a time like this. Reaching out to your own networks, being aware of the most important thing is your mental health and your ability to navigate through this time. And so taking care of yourself so that you can be there for others is a really important thing to focus on. I know for me too, I get a lot of sustenance from nature. So having time to really connect with the natural world, as well as with your own sense of peace, and whatever practices can sustain you through this time so that you've got the energy to be able to realize your potential in the time ahead, I think is really important.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jane, for your time and for being with us and for having such an insightful session with us. And we wish you all the best for your all future projects and endeavors. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Rajni.
Thank you guys for watching. Take care and bye.